Hello, everyone. Mr. Lipchick here. Today, our discussion is on the rise of kings, something that began in the late Middle Ages, where political power began to become concentrated in something known as the nation state. During the High Middle Ages, the European kings increased their economic and political power. Economic and technical changes allowed them to assert greater control over their kingdoms through alliances with businesses and peasant classes. These alliances allowed them to check the power of the nobility, and they would rally the lower classes in support of the emerging nation state, which was a political body based upon a shared culture, language, religion, or other set of beliefs. During the late Middle Ages, trade increased throughout Western Europe. This was primarily due to the Crusades, which had brought luxury goods from the East into European areas and expanded the trade routes as merchants sought to get at these goods and make a profit. And merchants established trading posts throughout Europe, which eventually evolved into towns. As towns emerged, labor shortages of peasants to work the land became a problem for the nobles. This was still an agricultural society. Wars and diseases, such as the plague, had already shrunk the peasant population, creating a labor shortage. And peasants increasingly migrated to the towns to seek better freedom and more economic opportunities and the chance to rise socially. The owners of fiefs began to pay peasants in money in order to keep them in their employ. Money allowed the peasants to accumulate wealth and purchase new goods. And this situation contributed to the decline of the manorial system because the serfs were eventually able to purchase their freedom and change their status. Trade in the merchant class continued to grow throughout this period, and a new, larger economic system emerged that made the manors, which were self sufficient and closed systems, obsolete. Feudalism began to disappear, and new social classes emerged. And banking and other economic institutions appeared, which further increased economic growth and activity. The towns grew in population and became important politically and economically. A new middle class of businessmen and craftsmen emerged. And the kings realized that by allying themselves with these commoners, as they were called, they could check the power of the nobility and increase their own political power and control over their kingdoms. Kings began to enrich themselves by taxing the towns and borrowing from the banks. Banks previously, during the Middle Ages, had been pretty much illegal, as the charging of interest for a loan was considered a sin. It was called usury, but now this was beginning to change. And by acquiring this money, they were able to establish their own professional armies and reduce their reliance on the nobility and increase their power, which led to a decline in the system of knighthood, and it led to the establishment of early professional armies, which were only loyal to the king. The power and success of the armies once depended upon horsemen, who were the knights, but new military technologies brought about a change. New weaponry, such as the pike, the longbow, and early firearms, allowed for the effective use of foot soldiers against horsemen. These new soldiers, known as the infantry, could defeat the knights on horseback using these new modern weapons. Foot soldiers used the pike, which was a long spear-like weapon, to unseat riders from their horses. The longbow, a powerful new bow and arrow system, could penetrate the armor of a knight. And early firearms and artillery brought new destructive power to the battlefield. So now the knights or the cavalry, their role would become less predominant in warfare, although still very important. So traditionally, only a nobleman could afford a horse. This was a class thing. The warriors were a class of noblemen. Now, peasants could play a military role with these new weapons and could become politically useful and important. So kings now used their political alliances with peasants, merchants, and craftsmen to fill their armies and counter the power of the nobility. Kings grew significantly in power and began the formation of nation-states. A nation-state is a sovereign state whose citizens or subjects are relatively homogeneous in factors such as language and common descent. And kings encouraged this concept, and they encouraged loyalty to the nation-state among all the various classes, especially the lower classes upon whom they relied. So by the end of the late Middle Ages, 4 large, distinct nation-states had emerged, and those were England, France, Spain, and Russia. And this trend would continue into the modern era with the addition of new nation-states throughout this period. And political power would continue to become concentrated in more and more efficient forms of the state. Thank you for attending. I hope to talk to you soon. Please have a nice day. Thanks a lot.